it is truly mailbox money, right? Like, people talk about that online a lot, and most of them are trying to sell you a course of some form or fashion, right? Just kind of how it is. But the triple net world is really a mailbox money situation. You are collecting a rent check. You don't think about it. They pay the tax, they pay the insurance and name you as additional insured. If you have a lender, they name the lender as additional insured. You don't do anything. They do all the maintenance, all the upkeep, everything. What I always counsel everybody is if you own net lease buildings, at least once a year, you should find a really good local market broker and just go buy them lunch, take them to lunch and sit down and pick their brain for a few minutes and talk about your lease and then what's going on and what's happening in their life. What trends are they seeing, right? Retail changes quickly.
I wanted to start with your earliest real estate memory because I know you come from a real estate family, and I always think it's interesting to know kind of like that origin story, the taproot story. What was yours?
Yeah. So my grandfather was an oil and gas landman, and he started investing in commercial real estate as a diversification. And so his deal is he would go put minerals together and then get a big tract put together. And then he would basically lease those to an exploration company that would come in and drill for oil and gas. And then would keep an overriding royalty in it. And so once he had gathered a little bit of money together, he started doing open book build to suits for Texaco. And so this would have been in like the mid to early and late 70s. He was doing those. And the problem that he had over time with doing those is that they all had put options. So like a stated purchase price. And what happened, over time as inflation hit, the value of the land far exceeded what the, original option stated put price was. And so all the operators ended up exercising. And so it was early 90s. I was like, 10, 11, 12 years old, somewhere in there. And I remember my dad driving me out, and it was an area that's now become the city of Draper on the south side of Salt Lake County. And, I remember like as a kid, we'd drive by on the freeway and there wasn't a freeway exit there. Or if there was, it wasn't much. And, my dad would point out like, hey, that's, there's mom's Texaco, right? On the side of the highway, right? Right there. And I remember they exercised the option and we drove out there and he was showing us, we were on like the way back from like a Utah BYU basketball game or something like that. And we pull off the freeway and we're looking at it. And I just remember it was a pretty big piece of land and he was really frustrated with what the price was that they were buying it for. And it's kind of wild because that has since become 6 retail pads. So the Texaco was large enough that it became 6 retail pads. And it's absolutely like prime position, one of the best intersections, in the state of Utah. And I'm sure they exercise it for just like hardly anything. So that's probably my earliest real estate memory.
Did you feel the need to get into real estate to carry on the family tradition, or was it something else?
It's a good question. I think I just kind of grew up with it. I remember going to my dad's office as a kid. He was a Coldwell Banker Commercial. They had the best training program for brokers back in the day. So he did that. And then he left and started working on behalf of Walmart, finding them sites. Then went and worked with a mall developer for a little while and then started his own shop. And so, through time, like from a like young child standpoint into my early adult life, I just always kind of grew up with it at the family office, right? And you'd show up, and when you're a little kid, you keep yourself busy at those offices by putting together. They all have the binder comb binding stations where you'd put the packages together. And we just do a whole bunch of blank sheets, and then that would be your coloring book for the day. And hopefully you could kill a few hours, right? Because it'd just be so boring. Well, who knows what dad's working on, but it was just awful boring. So I think it was so comfortable growing up with it in the family. And then when I wanted to get, I did like the satisfaction. He built a shopping center, redid a shopping center, and then redid a small shopping center and then rebuilt what became a much larger shopping center, pretty close to our family home of where we had grown up. And I remember seeing kind of the sense of satisfaction of just kind of seeing it come together for him. And that was during my high school years and into college. And so when I got into college, it was like, well, I think I want to become a real estate developer. And, he sat me down and he said, look, that's great. For 20 years before you do that, You need to go be an attorney. You need to be in title. You need to be a banker. You need to do construction. You need to be a broker. And I was like, no, I really want to be a developer. And he's like, right, you have to go do one of these other things for 20 years first and learn everything. And I said, okay, well, everything sounds boring except for contractor and broker. So, let's look at those. And at the moment, we had the best fit for a mentor as a broker. And so we pulled the trigger and I went and got my broker license and got myself hired with them. And there you go. The rest is history. And I fell in love with drive-thrus like right out of the gate.
So, what is it about a drive-through that's magical?
I don't know. It's just something satisfying to me, like watching the customers go through, the convenience that it offers so many of the customers. And I know now it's kind of entertaining because like on some of the social media links, a lot of the urbanists really like to really get after me for what we do. And I think it's interesting. They have an interesting standpoint, but for everyone that's yelling at me very loudly, there's like 1,000 plus totally satisfied customers that like to go through a drive-through. And they just don't communicate like the urbanists do. They're not as aggressive with their
Uh
communication. And
huh.
so I think it's just kind of a satisfying thing. And seeing a really high volume store is more satisfying too. Like it's kind of fun to like look at a site and decide, just take the customer. If it's a Dutch Bros, for example, and you're looking at a potential site and you're like, is this going to be a high volume store? Like if you take, all the stores in the Dutch Bros system, is this going to be a top 25% store for them? A second quartile store, or is it going to be a dog? Like, and then watching it go through the process and then watching the store open and then seeing how the customers respond and what happens.
Do you have any early real estate memories that have stuck with you that were like foundational learnings that are now just ingrained in everything that you do, whether it was something good or something bad or just something learned? Is there anything that you really hold on to that is like your North Star?
I have, I don't know about the North Star part as much. There definitely are a lot of things that I do consistently now, 22 years later, 23 years later, that I did when I started. I will never forget being a rookie and being, about 18 months into the business. And my senior partners had kind of helped me prep Starbucks. I was working for Starbucks at the time in this instance. And I want to say they had something like 15 to 20 stores in the entire state of Utah at the time. And for like 10 years, they'd opened some stores and then they didn't really do any growth for like 8 or 10 years. And they kind of drove their broker wild because they would get geared up, they get them all fired up, and then they go look at stuff and they just wouldn't pull the trigger. And so the account ended up moving over to our office and we got prepped and we had like 25 sites in that first tour package. And, it's until you've kind of done it like this, it's kind of interesting how real estate gets approved with a company like that. So basically you go get a 12 passenger van and you go pick up all these people at the airport and you've got operations people and your real estate manager who's kind of your go-to person or real estate director. A lot of the time you'll have their boss, and then sometimes if it's a really important tour you'll have their boss's boss. And so there could be easily eight or 10 people in a car. And so you pick them all up, you're driving because you know the market. You're usually the only locals. Occasionally they'll put in a local operations person, but even that, like most of the time they are transplants. They're not local to the market. And so you pick them all up and you start driving sites. And I am not even kidding you. Like it's so much worse than like driving somewhere with your kids when you get, 20 questions, right? Some of the most random questions come up and just left field stuff. And not about real estate, not even about the market. It's be like, hey, so do Mormons really have more than one wife? And like, so you're like trying to drive down the street. You're like keeping in your head, like, okay, what were the metrics on this next site? Like, what did that landlord tell me again that he would do the deal at? And then you're like, hey, do Mormons have horns? And you're like who in the third row is asking that question? Like, and right now, like what? Anyways, it's just like really intense. And so I think a lot of that taught me to be as prepared as I possibly can. So when I'm presenting something to a prospect, I really want to think through like, not the random questions, but like have I thought through, is there a floodplain that's attached to this property? And if so, what is my time frame to get through that? Is, what do the ingress egress points look like out onto the highway? It's a state highway here. Have I communicated to the DOT, and are we going to be able to get the ingress egress points that they're going to need to make it work? So I really try to think through a lot of those things. And I think a lot of that just came from those early days. By the way, for that first tour, we had 9 people. And
Wow.
as I was walking out into the parking garage, mind you, I'm 23 years old. I couldn't rent a car yet, right? So they had rented the tour bus, and they said, "Hey, we have a conflict, so you got to just run this tour." And I'm like, "What?" I'm like, "What do you mean?" And they're like, "Yeah, you're up. Like, you got to just do the tour." And I'm like, "By myself?" And they're like, "Yeah." I'm 18 months in the business, literally. I just brand new. And I'm like, "Well, I guess here we go." And they're like, "Don't screw it up. Don't lose the business. And, please don't crash the car because it's under our names." Right. And I'm like, okay, here we go. That was my first tour, first big tour.
How did the site selection process change from then, with maybe 20 years ago, to now? Like, what's different now?
We have so many fun tools. There's so many AI tools now. You got a ton of data sources. There's a lot of different versions at looking at cell phone data and how that impacts, a potential, like a projected sales volume for a location. At the end of the day, though, and I've learned part of this too, starting to do, the Dirt Dog pod as I've been interviewing retailers. Every guest I've had so far has basically said the same thing. There's nothing that really replaces sitting on the site, putting the dirt in your hand, looking around, getting a feel for the trade area, driving the streets, talking to the managers of your competitors, your peers, if you're going in front of a Target shopping center, go and talking to the Target manager and saying, "Hey, how do you think this kind of a store would do out front if we build it here?" Nothing replaces that. So those parts are the same. Where we're implementing the new data pieces is where it kind of helps you dial it in a little faster as to what might be a good potential site. But you gotta be boots on the ground.
So are you using the new tools to kind of narrow down the funnel? So maybe you have a list of 50 sites that you might be considering. Are you narrowing that down and then only visiting 10 based on the data that you like? Or are you still walking every single one?
What you gotta walk everyone that feels like a viable candidate that you've got a good potential tenant for. And most of our properties we buy with a tenant in tow. And sometimes we establish the tenant in tow as we're going under contract, but usually about the point in time we open escrow, we know who we're going to put there and what our business plan is. Lately, we've been looking at a lot of dark bank sites, and most of the banks don't want to give you the time that it takes to get a development process done. However, the flip side of that is most of the banks are located in super dense retail areas that don't have any other pad options. So we have been closing on a handful of those in kind of a quicker time frame, and we don't always have the tenant in tow. But I would say, I for every one site that I stand on that we do and we end up pursuing, there are probably 8 to 10 that we pass on. So you do spend a fair amount of time on site.
How important is it for you to be boots on the ground? Like, you have a pretty focused market area. So how do you think about where you're bringing your company and where you're not bringing your company?
We chase the tenants, right? So we'll go where the tenants want us to go. If a tenant has a need in X city, then we'll go dive in and go figure out X city. I've done enough drive-throughs now that I can find a top 25% store volume location in any market if you give me, a couple of days. So if I've got windshield time, couple of days, you can go drop me in and I'll go figure it out. I've never done any work in your backyard, for example, but if you gave me a map and a car, I'll go figure it out.
Is there a
Right.
lot of variability in execution, or are you bringing a lot of your subs with you?
We typically always find local GCs. We have definitely, figured out in the process of building, let's see, I think we're on somewhere like 45 ground ups right now. In the process of that many ground ups,
45 ground ups total, not going on right now, right?
total. Yes, that is total. Yeah. Currently we have
Wow.
10 active projects of properties we've closed on, but it's not, like a finished product yet. We've got 18 escrows, and then we've got 11 properties we're working on behalf of other third party owners.
Holy shit. we're going to dive into like the whole pipeline because that's just crazy compared to my business. So we got to talk about that.
Yeah, it's a lot of small deals, right? Like as I tell everybody, I was dumb. I chose retail, which means I fly on Southwest and Delta for the rest of my life. And then, like you guys and the apartment people and industrial, you're all really smart. You own your own jets and have 6 country clubs. And that's awesome, right? It's just, our life is singles and doubles, right?
The hotel business has felt like singles and doubles in some ways over the past 4 years. We have some pref deals that are going to be homers, but
Yeah.
hotels are tough too, man.
Yeah. I think everything's tough over the last few years, right? It just there's not been an easy moment here for a while. So we find local people. We do like rinse and repeat. We have a couple of different national firms that we work with for entitlements. Our biggest risk of execution is usually impact fees and connection fees. And man, the variability that exists there, Jake, like one municipality to the next is wild, right? Like you'll be working in some rando town and, it might be a really big town, but they'll hit you with a traffic impact fee and it'll be like, $500,000, right? And I mean, these are not projects that support a $500,000 fee that comes out of left field.
Yep.
And then you'll go and you're working with the same tenant in a different city and they have no traffic impact fee. And it might be a bigger city. And you're like, that was wild. Like what, why is it what one here and over here it's different? So I think we find less execution risk when we have third-party consultants that go and then we trust all that info, but verify it, right? So then we tighten it down and pin it down as tight as we can. And then ultimately you're trying to just solve that math equation as tight as you can get it. And then once we're zeroed in like that, we'll get the rent and the cost attached as good as we can get it. The retailer will run it through their real estate committee, approve it, and then we'll go to lease execution. And then you just hope you're right. That's the huck and pray time.
Well, let's go back before you started your business. How did you go from broker to whatever came next? What was that
Yeah.
process?
So I did generally listen to my dad. Okay. So I started in 2002 and then and I did tenant rep leasing from 2002, 2008, 9. During 8 and 9, anybody who survived knows we were all pretty bored during that time period. There was not much going on. And so at the time we were sitting in a retail boutique brokerage and I was sitting adjacent to a Newmark brokerage. We were kind of like sister companies. So I walked down the hallway to the number one sales guy at Newmark, and he typically, the year prior, he was just knocking it out of the park, selling 500,000 square foot, million square foot warehouses left and right. And he also was bored, and his golf game was as good as it was going to get. And so I was like, look, like you are not doing anything. I don't know sales. You don't know retail. Let's create a partnership and let's go sell net lease properties together and let's figure that out. And so he and I formed a partnership where we did that and we had a ton of fun and we probably sold, I don't know, 200 or 250 buildings over the next few years. And so that kind of got me going on the sales process, which was really critical to understand now that I'm in the development role, it's really, I'm happy that I have that background.
What was critical about it?
Just understanding how the entire sales process works, right? Like, when I started, we had represented retailers that were buying land that they would acquire and then build a Wendy's on or whatever else. But I don't think I totally understood the process, all the variables that went into contracts. I didn't understand the valuation process, how a cap rate was arrived at. Why does the typical net lease investment buyer buy a Starbucks versus a Wendy's versus a 7-Eleven? And so, to be in the net lease development space, it's good to understand that and have knowledge as to why somebody might buy one versus the other and why. So I started doing that in 08 and 9. And in 2010, at the end of 2010, I bought my first building, which was an Arby's, and had like 4 years left on the lease. And it was just a good strategic buy for us. The two sisters that owned it were in their late 70s, and they were kind of nervous because there was only 4 years left on the lease, and they didn't want to go through the risk of a tenant loss. And so their broker had established a market value for them. I felt like the market value was a good value for what was there, but I felt like I could raise rent because I knew the leasing side. And so sat down with my grandfather and dad at the time. We all felt comfortable with the plan, even though I was earlier in 20 years, because this really was my business plan. I knew leasing. And so I moved forward. I bought the building, and then we perfected the lease 3 years later and cut a new 20-year lease with them. And so, in fact, that Arby's just rolled into year 11 right now. So let's see. Yes, because it took a few years to get it done. So we just hit year 11 there. So, which is kind of fun because I'm halfway through. I did a 20-year fully amortizing piece of debt on that. And, I guess I got 9 years left.
So how did you think about the risk? Because the previous owner was nervous about the lease expiring. For you, that seemed to be your business plan. Were you thinking you were going to release Arby's, or that you had to potentially go to another tenant?
I just knew that it was worth more, whether it was Arby's or a new tenant. And for the leasing brokers that are out there in the world that are interested in dabbling and owning part of their own property, this is the easiest decision to make. Because, if you were going to say, for example, if you're going to, pivot the Wurzak family business plan, right? And you were going to go start doing net lease and you had identified a similar type property, you're not going to buy that without a lot of consultation with a leasing broker that's going to tell you, here's what I think market value is. Well, when you are the leasing broker and you know what the market value is, you really have an unfair advantage there. At least to the standpoint of getting comfortable with your underwriting risk. And so for me, it was just an easy decision to say, whether it's Arby's or it's, burger tenant or chicken or you name it, I knew the corner was worth more than what they were paying in rent at the time. That thesis proved to be true here, and Arby's decided they wanted to stay, which is great. And they did a remodel. And I've kept that building, still in that building today. And so I kept going through there, and then, we just kept buying buildings like that. We bought a few rehabs where we would buy like a strip mall, pull the front off, like especially anything where you see like like the terracotta slope tile
Yep.
in the front and like the tiny little sign bands, right? Like they're so tiny, you can't see the signage from the road. Every time you see one of those, if you can fix the facade and grow the facade from like 24 inches tall to like a flat surface of like 8 feet or bigger, and put the exact same sign back, it's wild, like the optical illusion of what it does. You can see the signage from the road like instantly. It makes it pop. So we did a handful of those and got pretty comfortable there. And then we did a whole another round of projects where I, partnered with developers that were in the greater kind of Salt Lake City market. And some of those were ground up projects. Some of those were we would buy an old shopping center, tear stuff down, build new stuff, rehab stuff, and work through a whole bunch of those. So what I kind of got there was an experience of working with multiple different development companies and seeing how lots of different people did deals. And, my dad's original thesis there was go learn how to do things with other people. And the more you learn hands-on like that, the better you're going to be when you decide to do projects on your own. And so we just kept going. And then in January of 2020, as we started that year at the year end prior meeting with my partners, we sat down and said, look, we think it's time. Let's form a ground up development team. And timing, oh, my goodness, is like, I'm not sure you could have picked a worse time than January of 2020 to start a ground up development team. So we started, and then this small little medical event hits the world, right? And then I remember like we're like working remotely. I'm like trying to keep a new team together. People don't even really know each other that well at
Yep.
that point. And we're under contract on stuff. And you're like, are we under contract? Like, is Mad Max like just going to take over the world? Like, is there society anymore? Does it exist? I don't know. It was just wild. And we got through that. And then we got a few projects out of the ground that year, which is amazing towards the end of the year. 21 had another nice year, started ramping up, and then really got going for a 2022. And then Jerome Powell just pulled the rug out on all of us, right? I mean, you included, I'm sure. So that was fun. And it's tough, because our business is a margin business and we're fixed, because once we've kind of fixed that rent with the retailer, we can't really go back to him and be like, hey, so our exit cap rate was a 5, ha ha ha. The Fed has kind of raised interest rates. Cap rates are now at 6. So there's no spread left, right? Or there's very little. And by the way, construction materials in the meantime, we're just going haywire through 21, 22, 23. And, this is not very fun. We're basically doing this for free. Like, can we just raise rent? Like, you can't really go do that. And so we got through that time period. It was pretty painful. And I feel like once we got through that, to me, it feels like we got a graduate degree, possibly a doctorate degree in development during that time period in a short fashion. And so it's felt better now. And now, I think this year is mostly just political. It was last year, a lot was political instability. You got the election. Nobody even wanted to talk about cap rates. And so, it's just feeling more stable each month, which is great. So we just closed 2 weeks ago on our 91st property.
Wow. I always think the best opportunity to grow is from learned experience. In my case, it's mostly been from mistakes. Doesn't mean like the whole deal blew up, but it's like, I could have done that one thing better. During COVID, we made a lot of preferred equity investments and we had a right to force a sale after 4 years. And if we wanted to force the sale, we could take over. We were already in the equity, but it could cause a lot of drama. It could cause a lot of tension. The legal process could be more expensive and more chaotic than the additional upsides. Maybe it's not worth it. And the one thing we didn't do was we didn't have like an additional incentive or a rate bump that our 4 year time horizon would coincide with. So for you coming out of, call it the period where Jerome Powell started raising rates, you had construction cost risk. Have you changed how you're thinking about doing business and how you're thinking about negotiating these deals to try and insulate yourself from that risk, to not have to take the risk and to pass it on?
Yeah, it's hard to pass that risk on to the retailers, just the way retailers function. What we have done though is we've chosen to capitalize much differently. And the biggest stress points that existed during those time periods where margins started, shrinking or evaporating. We've always been a deal by deal funder. And so we just have changed the whole method of how we do it. We typically used to back people into an IRR, and then we'd put up some of the money, they'd put up the bulk of the money. But then when we would own the LLC, we would split it according to what we thought would get them to a targeted IRR. And that's good if everything's working in a vacuum. But when it stopped working in a vacuum, it became very uncomfortable very quickly. And so we just have said, look, enough of that model. Let's not do that. Let's go back to more of a traditional syndicator approach. We still fund deal by deal, but now it's a lot of, here's a pref, and then there's a promote. Once you hit an aggregated IRR, maybe there's a second waterfall if the deal's big enough. If it's not, I mean, honestly, most of these deals are so small. It's just get in, get out, go to the next one. And we found over time our investors do better in some than they do in others. And, we have a lot of repeat people that keep coming back to us. So it seems to be working for them. Otherwise, I would assume they wouldn't come back. So, and then we've been funding a lot of other deals kind of uniquely. We figured out some ways where people can sell legacy assets in their portfolio. So like, maybe they own a legacy like triple net that they've already depreciated, it's kind of gone through its usable life for them. And then our brokerage firm will sell it, and then we'll basically roll them into the new property. We'll come in as a TIC partner with them and do a 99-year lease. So they get a 1031. We have a TIC partner. We didn't have to put up the bulk of the equity. They did. And then we'll go through 2 tax returns and then roll the entity up to the parent entity.
And how will you get a promote?
We typically we almost always put a chunk of cash in upfront, a decent sized chunk of cash, and it will take a carried interest. Sometimes just right out of the gate. Other times we have a carried interest that hits on there's like performance metrics for us, and we try to just structure those depending on what the deal looks like.
On that first Arby's, why do you still own it? Why didn't you sell it?
That was a fun one. So, like anybody on their first deal, I put every single dollar I had into that, and I mean, I remember like I'm literally like shaking writing a check, like back when people wrote checks, right?
Yep.
Okay. So I say Porter and Johnny on this call, probably, maybe they're not as used to writing a check, right? But you and I are. I remember shaking, writing this check out. And at the time I was brokering. And so I was representing, myself as buyer broker. And so I matched my brokerage commission,
Yep.
every dollar I had into it. And I ended up as a 7.5% owner in the Arby's. And then my grandpa was my partner. Okay. So he came in as my partner. And, over time, what ended up happening, I got the lease close to perfecting. And before I did that, he sold me his interest and then did a note. Right. And so he basically gave me my start as a developer, which was awesome. And, I'm not one of those guys that would ever sit here and say I didn't start on first base or somewhere farther. I did. And it's great. But either way, I got my start. And because he did that, he hasn't been with us for the last few years. But like, to me, it just makes me think of him. And so I'm sure, like all the rest of the people that I work with in the net lease space, once I die, my kids will sell it before I'm cold in the grave, right? Because that's how it goes. But for me, while I'm alive, it means a ton to me and it makes me think of him. And it's my first deal. And so, it's the only one I put on fully amortizing 20-year, a 20-year loan, and just said, I'm going to throw it away, not even think about it, put it on the shelf, never think about it again.
So a lot of people are going to be listening to this and maybe wanting to do the same thing, will do the same thing, but you decided not to sell. So you had to keep some machine going in order to
Yeah.
have income to live or to do other deals because you didn't pull any money out of that deal.
I
What
pulled it out.
what did you learn from that experience?
Yeah. I pulled it out in a refi. So I pulled money out at a refi. I paid his note off and got a little bit of a nest egg to go into my next one. And then that's when I didn't, I just kept going on these series of fix and flips or fix and lock, interest rate and pull as much loan proceeds out as I could. So I would go in, buy something that was undervalued. I'd get it to a point where I've maximized the value or maximized the cash flow within a long-term lease in place. And then I would look at it and say, okay, I can either make X if I sell or Y if I hold it and pull it out in loan proceeds. And I'd pull as much as I could out. We had the benefit, at that time period of like 10 to call it 2010 to 2017 of generally interest rates moving downward. And so that was an added bonus that allowed me to, on a lot of those projects, I would finance them. And then I came back in 5 years later and refied them and pulled even more money out. And so, that is what kept the engine running for a long time. During the last 5 years, we've been going the other direction on interest rates. And so, and we've also been, cap rates are still pretty low compared on retail, comparatively speaking to debt constants. And so, when I look at a deal now, it's like 9 times out of a 10, we have to sell. Mostly because, you can't really develop to a 6.5 and then go borrow at a 6.5 to 7, right? Without coming up with just a fortune. It's just so much money to hold them. And so we've mostly been exiting for the last little few years here.
A friend and mentor of mine, a guy, Dean Adler, who's Lupert Adler, he gave a little conference this morning that I went to, and he had this really great pitch that I've never heard before on triple net leases. I want to share it with you and get your reaction. He was talking about it more in the context of larger ones like shopping center, but it's essentially the same thing what you're doing. I think he just has to put out more capital. So he's doing a larger triple net lease deal. But he's basically saying investors, if they want exposure to triple net lease or these types of tenants, they can either buy bonds or a triple net lease deal. A bond on one of these tenants maybe is trading at 6-7% on a non-tax advantage basis, I think, because you're going to be paying income tax regularly with those payments. Or what his pitch is, you go do a triple net lease deal with one of these big guys. You're backed by their credit anyways, but you can lever it up and implement a value add real estate strategy and maybe get a 15-16% return on a tax advantage basis. And that was what he thought the huge arbitrage was in these triple net deals. Why do you think there's such a cult-like following for triple net buyers and owners?
Yeah, I think you have to break down first and look at who the triple net buyer is, right? And so rewind the clock back to 2008 and 9 when I started doing these sales. The customer that would sit in your car was typically a man. They were typically somewhere between their 55 and 75 years old. They read the journal. For those listening that don't understand, that's the Wall Street Journal, the paper copy, cover to cover, every day of the week, right? So whatever the journal says is what more or less is going to indicate everything in life. And almost all of them play golf. They pretty much all drive a Lexus RX or a Lexus ES or a Lexus LS.
Which means
That's
a lot of
pretty,
them live in Florida then.
oh, so many live in Florida. Yeah. And in my world, when we're working mountain and desert states, they're all California. Pretty much
Are they dentists
everybody's
as well, or not necessarily?
dentists. You get attorneys, you get doctors. You have a lot of people that are just second or third gen and they just have these big single tenant portfolios. And they might have, somebody get in your car and they look like the most unassuming person you've ever seen in your life. They're wearing Kirkland, Costco clothing, right? And they'll sit down and like I just remember this one guy I was driving around with. I was like, "How many net lease buildings do you own right now?" And he's like, "I think 59." And I was like, I think that's like a life goal, right? When you don't actually know how many cash flowing net lease properties you have, like that's probably a pretty good day.
Yep.
So for a lot of people like that, when you're building a portfolio, you're really just you're building out that portfolio and you're doing it similar to how you would build your financial portfolio, right? So your financial portfolio might have a mix of 30% bonds or whatever your percentages you like, and then 70% equities. And then inside of the equities, you have various kinds of equities. You've got growth, you've got cap, large cap, you've got whatever it is, and what your investment strategy might be, you've got it allocated. Well, as you sit down with somebody like that, that's a portfolio net lease buyer, having a similar kind of conversation. It's you own a Dairy Queen and you own a Starbucks and you own a Jiffy Lube. You don't own an auto parts store. I wonder if we should consider an auto parts store for your next acquisition. I wonder if we should consider a convenience store for your next acquisition. And what you're trying to do is give them exposure across asset classes of different types of use of retail. And so part of what drives those buyers is they're building out a portfolio. Another part of it is most of them are successful professionals in some other aspect of their life. And so they don't usually, most of them don't spend the cash flow that's coming in from the properties. And so all the cash flow does is just accrue, which means if they own, call it 5 properties and they've got conservative debt on those, they're buying another property every 5 to 7 years. And so another $1 million is sitting there just burning a hole in their pocket and they're ready to go into the next one. So a lot of them don't really ever benchmark it off of treasuries. Like you read that a lot online. Like, how can you buy this when treasuries are here? It's just so rare that you hear one of those investors mention that or even look at it as a comparison, because treasuries don't have the aspects of what Dean's talking about, and right, of what you just mentioned. The ability to borrow against the property is huge. The ability to get rental increases that are scheduled with a company that is, you can check out publicly is amazing. The other thing too is like go back to the Texaco example. There we were talking about land inflation, right? The land was inflating in value over time, much higher than what the lease had in place.
Absolutely.
There's also rent inflation, right? So, an example of that is when I was brokering for Starbucks, we back in the 2003 to 2005 time period, we would never do a rent over $100,000, right? Like that was a massive, huge rent number, just enormous, right? I remember we did 2 in Salt Lake and that whole run up that were just over 100 grand. And I mean, you'd have to get special approval from the West Coast team. And it was very involved. Right. And nowadays, you're seeing these new Starbucks come to market. I think the mean price on, if you just take all of the listings of Starbucks available for sale in the country right now, I think the mean price is like 165,000. So if you have one of the Starbucks that got built back in the mid 2000s, and your rent is escalated at 10% bumps, you're probably sitting at 120, 130. Whereas the new stores that are coming online right now are usually 160 to 220. And so what happens is, and this is not really, there's not an easy way to underwrite this part of it. But what happens is if you can get to the end of the life of that lease and you're comfortable with a go dark risk, then what you can do typically is ratchet that rent way up.
With the same tenant.
Sometimes with the same tenant. That's what I did with Arby's. Yeah. Other times you got to re-tenant, right? I mean, that happens, and re-tenant risk is real. This is why one of the constant mantras that I tweet about and put on LinkedIn is get to know your leasing brokers. They're the most valuable part of the process if you're in retail.
But if you're a guy that just owns all of these triple net deals, what are they needing? Why are they even talking to leasing brokers? Because they're just collecting a check. They're not evaluating current market rents.
That's a good point. It is truly mailbox money, right? Like, people talk about that online a lot, and most of them are trying to sell you a course of some form or fashion, right? Just kind of how it is. But the triple net world is really a mailbox money situation. You are collecting a rent check. You don't think about it. They pay the tax, they pay the insurance and name you as additional insured. If you have a lender, they name the lender as additional insured. You don't do anything. They do all the maintenance, all the upkeep, everything. What I always counsel everybody is if you own net lease buildings, at least once a year, you should find a really good local market broker and just go buy them lunch, take them to lunch and sit down and pick their brain for a few minutes and talk about your lease and then what's going on and what's happening in their life. What trends are they seeing, right? Retail changes quickly, right? And so many examples of that. But look at just like meal delivery, for example. Meal delivery did not exist 10 years ago. I mean, it's kind of hard to even fathom that right now, right? With how prevalent it is in the world and how frequently, even it's used in my household. And that's a trend that shifted things, that shifted the way retailers are thinking. And so if I was a net lease owner and I was checked out for 10 years, I wouldn't really know what was going on. And I might not know the kitchens are shrinking or they're expanding. It just depends on what's happening in the market. So I always just recommend it for everybody sit down at least once a year, just dust off your file folder, right? Because it should be gathering dust because you don't have anything to do. But dust it off once a year and sit down and just have a discussion with a leasing broker.
Why is it important to have, I would think it's important to have like different types of food or restaurant options. Like, you want to have a Starbucks and a Chick-fil-A or something, not all Starbucks, because if something bad happens to Starbucks, you're wiped out. But why is it important to also diversify across uses?
Well, a good example of that is I mentioned an oil lube tenant with Jiffy Lube just a few minutes ago. Well, there is a tremendous amount of Teslas and other electric vehicles on the streets that I see every day. None of them go to Jiffy Lube or Take Five or Valvoline or oil changers or any of them. And so, is that a use category that's going to become extinct in a few years? Or at least just are they going to be shrinking in store footprint? Likely. That's the way the trend looks at the moment. Or are they going to evolve their business plan and do they become mini service centers for electric vehicles? Don't know. Not sure. But back to the point of retail changing, you have to constantly be watching the change and where it's headed. Chicken is on a resurgence. So at the same time, we're watching some of the legacy kind of older school chicken concepts not really have same store sales growth. In fact, some of them they're declining. At the same time, we're watching new entries to the market like Dave's Hot Chicken, Lane's, Raising Cane. I mean, they're raising the bar so much higher than we ever thought possible on chicken sales. So you got to be watching those trends and you got to be looking at that. And then you got to be looking at your portfolio and saying, okay, it is, we're selling burgers today, but what else can go here? Right. Yes, this might be a McDonald's location and sure they may be here forever. But if they're not, am I on the AM side of the road or the PM? Right. If I'm on the AM, is this a good coffee site? Well, I would want to know that. And a good leasing broker is going to have that dialogue for you. They're going to help you understand that. But I just think it's better to diversify into different industry clusters. I think you have a more balanced portfolio that way.
At least in Florida, gas stations are all on A plus sites, like typically like a corner, almost like a bank pad. Have you thought about maybe we electrify, maybe we don't, but have you thought about buying gas stations as a long-term real estate play to then re-tenant it to something else or come up with a different strategy if gas eventually evolves?
So at the moment, most of the new gas stations we're seeing come online have a rent somewhere between $300,000 and $600,000. And so by the time you put a 5 to 6.5 cap on there, that you're talking about quite a bit of money for those corners. So I think when you look at the new ones, it becomes more of a strategic decision, right? You would if you're going to buy a new gas station like that, I would want to make sure I am well located. I am super close to a major intersection, or even better, like a highway or an interstate. Um, but you definitely want to be eyes wide open. We have repurposed a lot of old gas stations we're also buying a lot of real estate from gas stations where they went in and bought 4 or 5 acres, and they don't need 4 or 5. They just need an acre and a quarter, 2 acres on the corner. And then we're buying excess from them and then trying to put complementary uses adjacent to them. So what you described isn't really my business plan at the moment, but I do think gas still represents a good value proposition for investors. I just would want to be eyes wide open on some of the brand new product.
How is cloud kitchen changing your investment strategy or how you're building these deals?
How long has it been since you ordered something through a meal app?
Oh, 3 hours.
Okay. So in the last 30 days of your life, have you ordered from a concept on DoorDash or one of the others that like it was a restaurant and you're like, huh, I've never heard of that restaurant. I wonder where that is.
I'm not one of the people that do that.
Okay. So there are a lot of people in the world that do.
Yep.
What's wild is where this food's getting prepared. It's getting prepared all over the place. And we had around about, if you rewind the clock like 6, 7 years ago, we had like Kitchen United, and there were a couple other groups that were coming through, and they were like, okay, we're going to systemize this. We're going to build out commercial kitchens, and then we'll sub rent out to these concepts. And that business plan it was a great idea. It was just executing it became very cost prohibitive very quickly.
Yep.
And so what's ended up happening is a lot of the meal delivery prep is coming from all over the place. And I don't think we're there yet. I don't think it's clear. It's very murky to figure out where we're headed. I think one thing is, safe is that I like the concept of a restaurant with lots of rooftops around it, because I think the more rooftops around it and having a viable kitchen, it's similar to the last mile delivery in the industrial world. The closer you can get that kitchen to the customers, the better. And so if you've got a nice sized restaurant that's got maybe a Burger King in there, yes, they might be serving Whoppers all day, but they also might be doing tacos or pizza out of the back in a few years. I don't know. Right. And I think to me, it's amazing to see where we're headed.
Why do cap rates change with the popularity of the retail tenant? Like, obviously, there's some risk adjustment in there, but I've seen some of your posts and there are like, in and outs that are trading for like a negative cap rate, it seems. If they're paying a similar rent to another tenant, why do people chase that to such a tight cap rate versus, getting paid a great rent from another high quality company?
So I think a lot of it, well, first off, let's stick in food for just a moment, right? So in food, you've got Chick-fil-A, which is the clear granddaddy of all of them, the highest volume, average unit volume in the chain. So take the mall stores out of the way. Chain average is doing just under $10 million a unit, blows everybody else out of the water. In and Out doesn't report sales, but they're right up there. And so is Raising Cane's, right? Raising Cane's is doing some phenomenal business. And so once you get past those three, you drop down below $5, $6 million a unit, and you get to the next one, which is McDonald's, which sits right in the mid 3 millions. So just think about that for a moment, right? An average Chick-fil-A is doing what is or 2.5 times the volume of an average McDonald's.
Wow.
So it kind of moves those three tenants like into their own category. And then there's everybody else. And so, I those three tenants are always going to demand a premium for cap rate. Their cap rates are going to be lower than everybody else. I think it helps a lot that you've got like Chick-fil-A as a debt-free company, In and Out as a debt-free company. I actually don't know on Cane's. I believe they are as well, but I'm not sure. But having a debt-free company that's owned by a private person or private persons is a whole different profile than when you start looking at McDonald's corporate, right? Or you start looking at Wendy's corporate. And I think it gives the investors so much confidence that everything's going to be fine, because you're now dealing with they're the best of the best tenant, and they're way above all of the entire industry. And so I just think because of that, they're going to demand a better cap rate. The interesting one for me to have been watching over the last few years is watching Dutch Bros average sale cap rates go lower than Starbucks average sale cap rates. That's been kind of phenomenal to watch. Like, because here you are, like Dutch just hit over 1,000 stores, I think last month. You're talking about competing against a brand with Starbucks that has 42,000 stores worldwide. massive global company, owns, vertically integrated, owns coffee farms all throughout the world. And here it is, this tiny little, originally out of Grants Pass, Oregon company knocking at the door and then eclipsing them and selling for average cap rates that are lower. It's kind of nuts. And I think there you're just watching, they responded to consumer trends very quickly. Dutch did, because, it's like a small little speedboat in comparison to a cruise ship. As the consumer trends shift, Starbucks is slower to move because they're bigger and it just takes more effort for them. I think it's also a little bit like, again, a lot of these buyers golf, right? And so I think they go to the country club and, Jim just bought a Dutch Bros and he's telling everybody how he's killing it on his rent checks. And so Ted's like looking over a bill and he's like, God, maybe I should buy a Dutch Bros. And he's like, well, I'm going to go get one first before you. So I don't know if that is what causes a little bit of herd mentality, though, probably.
What is stopping you from just going out and developing 100 Raising Canes, 100 In-N-Out burgers? Is it capital? Is it available good sites? Are they basically saying they only want to open X amount of new stores a year? What's the break on that relentless throttle?
It's all about the retailer demand for how many stores per year. I don't know on those two what their store expansion plans are per year. I would guess maybe 75 to 100 based upon what I see from my vantage point. And so, I don't think any one developer is going to be able to eclipse that much of their business plan. If we were able to do a couple, I would be thrilled, right? And so, you know, uh, we spend a lot of our time finding high quality sites, right? So a lot of the dirt dog, mantra of what we've kind of become as a persona is finding the high quality sites, right? And so we're looking for, where can we go buy something that whenever we find the retailer that's going to go there, they're going to have a top 25% store. And so I would say a lot of the time we'll find a site and it might be a tremendous site, right? Like, and we're looking at it for X tenant. And then all of a sudden Aspen Dental shows up and is like, we would like to be here. Well, I didn't have on my business plan for us to go do a deal with Aspen Dental. They have 1,100 locations. They got great credit. I mean, why not do an Aspen Dental? But it's not really what was on my business plan originally. And so sometimes you're just morphing to the deal. So I guess to answer your question is, we are constantly looking for the best of the best sites. And, we do have some tenants where we've had a programmatic relationship and we really appreciate those. But if a retailer is going to open 200 stores in a year, which is pretty good growth for most of these retailers, to hand me 20 is 10% of their entire pipeline. Well, from their side, they're reporting to Wall Street that they're going to open
Yep.
200 stores. They can't take execution risks that, I mean, whatever, I have a problem, I pass away. I mean, whatever it might be, right? Like, what happens if I have execution risk on 20 stores? That's a huge liability for them.
How high is the bar for you to become an approved developer for a Dutch Bros or someone on that level?
It's not like, it's
Because
not
with
like you go to,
hotels, it's pretty like, they won't, the site, if the site's great, they still have to evaluate you as the developer and the owner and the operator. Is it the same way in your world?
yes, it's more relationship based than anything, which probably is similar for you, I would think.
Yep.
And it's not like you go to, like, CCIM courses and then you finish your last one and they're like, okay, here's your CCIM pin. You can put it on your lapel now, right? Nobody tells you you are a preferred developer. All of a sudden you wake up and you're like, okay, I've got a dozen deals going with X retailer. You are a preferred developer for them, right? Like, for that is, again, nobody awards you that is what you are at that point. I think you just got to work in with them and they got to get comfortable that you know what you're doing and they've got to get comfortable that you can deliver. And so, again, go back to the 200 store example. If we're going to run Jake's Tacos, right? And this is your new concept and you are engaging with me and you're saying, let's go get some sites done, you're probably going to give me one or two, even of 200, right? And you're going
Yep.
to see how I do. And well, it takes a year to get stuff done pretty much, right? So then in a year, we're evaluating again. Maybe it's 9 months. So we're a little ahead of the curve. And you're seeing how I did on those projects. You're like, okay, it's year two. Why don't we go do three or four? Maybe we do five. And, you kind of grow into the relationship. And there's a big difference, by the way, of completing up to five per year for someone and then more than five. Once you go more than five, that is scaled growth. I've got to feel an ultimate degree of confidence that I can either exit your deal with a sale or I can exit with financing. I've got to, get comfortable that I can build your mousetrap exactly as you want me to build it. You have to be comfortable and I've got to be hand holding with a lot of these operations teams to make sure that they're happy with what we delivered to them. I think a lot of the dynamics change once you go over 5 units per year with someone.
I want to go somewhere else, but talk to us a little bit about what you're actually delivering. Like, are you delivering a turnkey interior fitted out restaurant, or are you just delivering basically a white box and then they're coming in and building the inside and doing all the equipment and IT and all that?
So we had a really fun one that we worked on in Allen, Texas last year. So north side of DFW. And in that, we bought a piece of land the third week in January. And I've gotten to know through real estate Twitter Daniel Harold really well. And Daniel's kind of a data hound. And so I thought this would be kind of fun. Let's put up a construction camera on the site. And I'm going to hire you to sell this when we get done building a Dutch Bros and get the store open. Let's put a construction camera on the site and let's have you put an OM together about halfway through the process. And we'll put a link to the construction camera on the OM. And
Love it.
to my knowledge, I don't know if anybody's ever done it. Daniel and I, we had a riot. It was so entertaining, right? And I mean, they would send the package out to buyers. So any interested party that would inquire would be like, okay, here's the package. By the way, here's a live construction camera. And so, it was like first week in May, second week in May, and investors would go on, look at the construction camera and be like, well, it's not open yet. And he'd be like, right, yeah, it's under construction. That is today. That's right now. And that was actually way entertaining. That was a really fun way to do it. So we bought a pad. It was either the second or third week in January, and then we sold the Dutch Bros the third week in June. So in,
Wow.
out. And when
Wow.
we sold it, the building was built. For a Dutch, they typically require us to do a little bit more than a shell. So sometimes we're doing a warm shell, sometimes we're doing cold shell. Dutch, we do a little bit more. We help them a little bit more like signage runs, a lot of those electrical conduits, all that kind of stuff, put the sign, bases in. And then they come in, they get it open. It's usually a pretty quick turn for them. So, but it was an open operating, rent commenced, new lease, absolute triple net lease that was in place with them.
So what kind of multiple do you do on a deal like that?
Equity multiplier.
Yeah.
We usually focus on return on cost and on an unlevered basis. So I'm usually looking at a 20% unlevered yield on cost. So profit divided by total cost. And so they're
Are you
just
buying them unlevered mostly? Or are you using financing?
we use financing. And then of course we need to return, a sizable portion of the, proceeds to the investors for their
Yep.
investment. And so, but yeah, we typically focus on a 20% return on cost metric. That's where we
Wow.
usually lock rent.
Hotels are like, I mean, I think you'd be happy if you're doing a 10.
Return on
Big
cost.
difference. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. But you're also, think about what you're doing there. You're not a merchant builder, right? And so, you're looking at that and you're saying, okay, what's rack rate tonight? What's rack rate going to be in 8 years? Is inflation really done in this country? Not likely, right? Like,
Yep.
so, and you can adjust your rates every night, right? Whereas our rates are locked, right? We do not move. You can't move the rent rate. It's done. Now, if you happen to be under construction or ahead of schedule, so your interest reserve is lower and you can save money, that's a bonus. Um, for every for every one that is, there's a lot that are not. So
Take me back to, I don't know, this 2020 period when you said you wanted to run a full-fledged development shop. What did that mean? Were you like a kind of family enterprise, like solo real estate guy before that? Like what changed in that time period where you described it that way?
so I started as a broker in 2002. Right before I switched back into investment sales in '08, I did a 3-month stint at our family office, and decided that I worked much better with everybody when I was a consultant and I was outside the office. So I haven't been in a family office environment since. We do have a handful of family members that work here on our team, which is awesome. And I really appreciate that. But it doesn't feel or look like a family office. We have three companies that are sitting here inside of one office suite. One is our brokerage company where we have 28 brokers.
Wow.
Another is a property management company where we manage 5 million square feet of commercial property that's kind of spread throughout the mountain and desert states.
What kind of
And then we
properties?
industrial, retail, not too much office. We have a lot of large box industrial in Salt Lake. And so those are really awesome management assignments. Tenants are usually pretty easy to work with. Most of our capital groups are awesome, just really good people. So that's our management team. And then I run our ground up development team. And so as we pivoted, it was me adding a few new humans, into the office suite here and us saying we now do ground up development.
But you kind of did that before to some
We,
extent, or
we,
not really?
we did. We just always would partner with another developer and take it vertical with them.
So what changed in your mind from partnering with someone to being able to do it solo?
I became the sole person that was signing on construction loans or with my partners right here in the office.
Yep.
I became the responsible authority that if it hits the pro forma, it's solely on me. And if we don't, it's solely on me. So, it felt like taking the security blanket off maybe, or the training wheels you could pick your metaphor there, but there's some comfort, right? Like there's some comfort in being in something with a bigger developer that, has done a whole bunch of projects and has a whole bunch of experience, even if it's not in your asset class. We did a handful of deals with a group that owns like 35, 40 hotels. And, retail wasn't their primary asset class, but here, that individual had started their company on flipping corners, similar to how I was doing that structure, in the 2010 to 2017 period. And so going back into the corner business for him was a lot of fun because it kind of like invigorated good, good, fond, few familiar feelings for him. And we're goofing around at $2 to $3 million a whack versus your world, which is nutso, right?
Yeah, it gets heavy. It's
Yeah,
it's hard to make things pencil from a construction standpoint in this environment, not because necessarily just the numbers, but also the risk. I mean, building a hotel takes potentially 2.5 years. And we had experience where you could see a cycle change over that period of time. Whereas if you can get in and out of a Dutch Bros in 7 or 8 months, that's a completely different ballgame.
yeah, yeah. So we spend a lot of our time. We probably spend more time at our office right now working on operations, meaning speed. How do we get the time down? How do we get time of delivery faster? And I will tell you, every time we start talking like that, it really makes our retailer clients happy. For them, they don't want to lose a week of sales, right? And so, I think reported average volume from Dutch last was 1.95 million. Let's just call it $2 million, right? For every week of sales, there's another $40,000 of top line that they've lost. And
Yep.
so, if we can open one 4 weeks sooner, they're very happy with us.
What are the little tricks that you figured out to expedite the process?
It's best if we have landowners that will give us the time to do our job. I don't usually argue a whole bunch with landowners on pricing, provided they're at market price, and I believe they are. And my conversation always with them is, give me the time to help me make your property worth what it is worth, right? To do that, I've got to get to a building permit in hand, right? I've got to get to bids from my contractors, right? I got to be ready to roll. And if it's not that, I've got to attach some version of a discount because I might not get there. And you may not like that discount. I'd rather pay you the whole price. I mean, to me, that's better for you. It's also better for me. So I usually, spend a lot of time upfront with the landowners trying to figure out what do they want, right? And then, yeah, that doesn't work for everybody. Like we're buying a property right now where somebody has a real need and they need us to close in a certain time frame. And so for them, they would rather take the discount, which is fine. We can try and bake in an appropriate discount and see if we get comfortable with that risk. And if we do, then we go forward.
Yeah. Because if I was the landowner, right, I'd say, well, I'm basically just giving you an option to see if your deal works. And I'm kind of sitting here waiting. And if it doesn't work, then I might have missed out on, Chris's cousin down the road who could have bought it. How
Yeah.
do you answer that
U-
objection?
Usually it's a piece of land or it's a dilapidated fast food building. So it's either way, it needs basically the cost of a new building, right? And so if I go into a 20-year-old Taco Bell, I can assure you I'm going to spend just as much money as though I just built a brand new building. It's the same cost. So you have this building sitting there. I've got earnest money up with you. So maybe there's 10 or 25 grand or something there. I start my third parties. There's another 10 to 15,000 just to figure out what's there. And it probably 25 if I have to go measure a building. Right. And so then once I've got a building measured or once I've got and engineered out the survey, I can start all the work from an architecture and engineering perspective. So by the time I'm done and I'm, call it 6 months to 9 months into the process, I am hopefully a full site plan approval, working on a building permit, and I'm usually 80 to $140,000 hard into the project. Now, those costs only work as a landowner, those costs work for me, but they're kind of irrelevant for you. Now, what I might have done is done a survey, which is good. I might have done a phase one environmental, which I hand over to you. Maybe I did a geotech, which is good for you. But the rest of the stuff, like you don't care if I've got a set of Dutch Bros plans, it doesn't mean anything. But if I can't get the city to approve a Dutch Bros, I can't close. And so, that's that is the trade-off, right? And so I'm trying to get you to that X purchase price, but to do that, I've got to do the homework on my side, or I've got to give it an appropriate discount rate attached to it.
What's the process to keep? I think you almost have like 20 development projects going right now. How do you keep that? How do you manage that?
So for my component and what my responsibilities are on the team, number one, I created an entire wall that's a whiteboard in my office. And so just one that helps me keep entities straight and projects. We I think we're using Trello to track everything internally now. We were at Monday, we just moved to Trello. And so it's just that's our software program that our team likes using.
For like checklists and stuff?
Checklists and just where's it at and what do we need to do this week and what's our timeline. We move back and forth between there and Excel spreadsheets. We've tried various, construction management products, project development softwares. I just think an Excel spreadsheet at the end of the day is cleaner and easier than most.
Yep.
And so we use a lot of Excel, but you're constantly, we meet once a week minimum for a scheduled meeting with the whole team. Everybody, this year is our year of systems. So we're getting much better at this person does this person does that, and trying not to overlap with each other. I think I've been trying to get rid of the overlap. And part of that is we've just hired on a few more people over the last few years. So trying to have an identified role for each person and what they are responsible for that's one of our big goals this year. And then you just got to look at each project each day and say, what am I doing to make progress here? And, in the back of my head right now, I have about 9 things that I need to accomplish. When we end here, we're going to hang up. I'm going to go get my car. I'm driving to the airport. I'm flying to Dallas. I got to go look at a couple sites tomorrow. And, but before I get to the airport or before they close that plane door, I got to call 9 people. So you just got to keep grinding.
You're grinding. I love it.
And then in the middle of all that, I'll have 3 brokers call me and say, can you look at this real quick? And which is very distracting, but it's distracting in a good way. Because when they call, that's when we make money because it's a new project.
And are they calling you or are they calling your team? Are you looking at it? Or are you sending like an acquisitions person to look at it? What does that look like?
We got a couple of us that are dirt dogs. And
Okay.
in our office, the dirt dogs are hounding out the new deals, right?
Okay.
So for those that are, it's actually funny. The main person that helps me is a dirt dog. His dad actually originally trained me in the business. And
Cool.
so it's super fun to come full circle and be training him in the business, it brings me a lot of joy in life to do that. And so primary point is he or I, and we'll take a quick look at it and we'll try to figure out, who's it a fit for. When it's a tenant rep broker calling, those are the hot ones, right? Because I represent X tenant and they want to go here. And I've now identified a seller. Can you get an offer to me? No problem. Right. And we'll get it right out the door. Because they already have done the homework. They know who's going to go there. And now we just need to get in and go play the role.
What's the biggest business mistake you've made?
Today, last week, you tell me, but
Recent memory.
yeah, I don't think I'm over the pain of Jerome Powell in 2022 yet. So I would tell you still, I've made a lot of mistakes since, but like the one that and you can tell as I'm describing this, because you can probably hear it in my voice. I was so uncomfortable with how our equity stacks were working during that time period. And this whole concept that these investors had a lot of money in these deals, and we had a lot less money than they had. And all of a sudden, like, margins are shrinking and compressing. And like, the pressure that that was causing was so awful. And in every scenario, we went back through, worked through each deal. Thank goodness we didn't have anything that was just like a total just train wreck. These are smaller deals, so that helped a lot. But we just didn't have anything that was like double or triple, not double, but like 10, 20, 30% off of losses. It wasn't anything that bad, right? It's just a lot of them we were doing them at margin, right? Just, can we get everybody's money back and go to the next thing? And so I just think I hated the way that I was structured. And so I think the counsel that was given to me originally of wait 20 years to be a developer was really good for a lot of training aspects. But the other part I would add to that is just putting even more of your own skin in the game, right? And it just would have felt, at least a little bit comfortable. Even if I had $1 of investor money, I'm still going to feel uncomfortable if all of a sudden all the variables start changing at the same time, which is what that was. But I just feel like I didn't like that structure. And so the way we've structured our deals is way different, right? And that caused me to go back through and say, where can I free up capital in my portfolio? How do I put more of my skin in the game? How do I get more comfortable with doing these deals? And how do I get more comfortable that we can execute in a really timely fashion? And so I think that is just so etched in my brain right now. It's like branded in my brain. So
So in those deals, maybe you had a lot of sweat equity, but maybe there wasn't a lot of cash equity, and you would have preferred more alignment with your investors.
I think we were just scaling quickly, and our scaling year was the start of 22. And so all of a sudden we bit off more than we can chew, and then the variables all changed. And so as we're starting to grow now, and as you hear, as I rattled off what we're working on, we have the 10 active deals that we already own. There, of course, are always like a dozen background items from every other property. They're not all triple net deals. So maybe we got a shopping center here that's lost a tenant. And, not only are we working on it, but we got to split a space, or we got to put a new HVAC unit in. There's just, that stuff is constant. It never goes away if you have multi-tenant. But we have 10 deals that aren't at a stabilized rent proposition that we own. We have 18 deals that we're in escrow on, right? Of the 18 deals, we have a couple different structures for how we're going to capitalize those. Some of those, again, are some of those 1031 strategies where we're bringing in family offices to work with. Others are just repeat customers where it's like, let's go do 5 deals with you. And then that's easier because you look across 5 deals and you say, in aggregate with this one family office, if we go knock out 5 deals, we have really good track record across, multiple deals like that. It's always the onesies, twosies where you can really, have a problem if things go wrong. And then we have 11 that we're doing for someone else. And so as we're scaling, what I've supplemented in here is I've supplemented in those third party deals, which allows our team to perform at a level that our team can perform at. But it's not, I'm not sitting there where I've got all these outside investor dollars at, risk every day. And I'm, losing my mind thinking about it. Right.
Is that how would you typically put investor capital up for pursuit costs and a deposit as well? Or is that like internal money? Because
Always
there's a
internal
lot. I
money.
mean, if you have 10 or 18 in escrow, each one of those is a couple $100,000 of cost and deposit.
We do not put that to investors.
Yeah, that's big. That's big. 100%.
Yeah.
You
The
got it, man.
11 deals that we're working on, we're working for a legacy fast fooder that has a couple hundred locations. So for them, we're converting, 11 of their restaurants that they have no longer are operating out of. So for them, if we're going in and spending chase costs, those chase costs are like, look, you guys built this beautiful building in 1984. That's awesome. I was born in 81. It's kind of old, right? Like me, right? Like, maybe let's just get an architect in there. Let's go ahead and get some, get some drawings done. Let's get a LiDAR in here. Let's get a CAD file created. For them, that, like, on that, they own the building, right? I mean, so we're spending chase dollars for them, but like, It goes with the building. Every tenant that's going to look at that needs CAD file first.
Yep.
And so the dollars we're spending there, are just, they're not the ones that you always worry about those first dollars out. Those are the riskiest ones. And so I think that's been the hardest part, is figuring out. I was listening to a podcast the other day with one of our really prominent home builders here in Utah. And he kept talking about home builder equity. And he kept talking about the equity that it took to build a home building company. And all of a sudden it hit me what he was talking about. The equity to run a home building company is like my world and your world, but times 100. I mean,
Yep.
can you even imagine? Like, you're carrying land. I mean, I don't even know how people sleep if you're in the home building business. That is wild.
It's tough. That's why a lot of them are public, because they get to use someone else's money, but then they also have land developers that basically do all the entitlements for them. A lot of them won't close unless the horizontal work is done. Some of the big ones.
Yeah. So he just kept using that term, home builder equity. And I was like, oh, that's what he's talking about. It's that float, right? I mean, you're constantly,
It's heavy.
and yeah. And then you go kill it. Right. And you sell something at like just a really low cap rate, right? Because somebody really liked the property. It was a home run deal, and you want a high five, but you can't, because all those dollars went right back out the door to the next 4 deals. Right. It's entertaining.
That sums it up.
Mm-hmm.
I asked all the guests on the podcast the same closing question, and that's, what's your favorite hotel? Not one that you've invested in, but what's your favorite hotel to stay in?
The coolest hotel that I have ever stayed in my entire life. This is very much off brand from the Dirt Dogs. We're going high end here. Okay.
Give it to me.
Yeah. It's, let me see if I don't butcher this name. You may know the name of it. It's the Cap de Rock Hotel. I think it's in Antibes, France, on the south of
The
France.
Eden Rock.
Eden Rock. Yeah, there you
Eden
go.
Rock Cap d'Antibes.
Yeah.
It's one of the greatest hotels ever, actually. They just gave me a rate that was like $11,000 a night for this summer. And I don't know, think I'm going to pass, but it's an amazing hotel. And you can't even get in. You have to beg them to get in.
So I went in the summer of 21. And so they had not recovered from COVID. And my rate was still gross.
I love it.
It was very expensive. But my wife and I were over there. We were celebrating an anniversary trip, and like, we're playing tennis on the clay tennis court, like we know what we're doing. And like, what an epic property that
Red
is.
clay. It's epic.
Yeah. If I'm out on the road, though, I pretty much stay in a Hilton product, because we've gone into a handful of Hiltons. And of the Hilton products, I will always default to a Canopy or a Conrad, right, if I can. And then if I can't, I usually try to find the best Hilton, just regular Hilton. So
it's a great recommendation. I love it. Thanks for coming on the podcast.
Thanks for having me. Yeah.
Awesome.